recognizes the Leader of the Third Party.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, this time allocation motion is a perfect example of how the parliamentary system, our beautiful Westminster, elegant parliamentary system, has become dysfunctional here in New Brunswick in particular. Time allocation should be used in many ways as it was intended, to bring in this House the three parties together to negotiate an acceptable distribution of time for the bills. That's what happens in other parliaments. Throughout the Commonwealth, Mr. Speaker. Throughout Canada, Mr. Speaker. In the mother parliament in Westminster, Mr. Speaker. That's how time allocation was really intended, and typically that's how it should be used, to bring about collaboration around how we allocate our time in discussing bills. In fact, if done properly, originally, it should have enabled members of the Standing Committee on Economic Policy to negotiate the adoption of a reasonable timetable for examining and amending bills. Instead, Mr. Speaker, the government is using time allocation as a guillotine to curtail debate on many bills and to avoid consideration of amendments on many bills, Mr. Speaker. So this is a travesty of how our parliamentary democracy is supposed to work, Mr. Speaker. So how did we get here? The job of committee members is to provide, according to our own mandate for the Standing Committee on Economic Policy, is to provide a thorough and specialized examination of bills, and of course to amend them when needed, Mr. Speaker. And none of this is happening. We're not really getting a thorough and specialized examination of bills, certainly not with this time allocation motion. Amendments are certainly not being considered with any seriousness at all. The amendments I brought were all rejected. I had, in fact, 11 amendments in total, many of now which will never be considered when you look at the bills that are included in this time allocation motion. 11 amendments. Let me just give you an example, Mr. Speaker, of an amendment around the Bill 5, the extramural bill, where the bill plans to repeal the definition of extramural care from the Regional Health Authorities legislation, Mr. Speaker, eliminating the kind of direction that if this goes forward, we absolutely need to provide to Medavie to ensure that in law they know what kind of care they're supposed to provide. Short-term care, long-term care, acute and long-term care, or acute and chronic care, and palliative care, and rehabilitative care. Mr. Speaker, that spells it out. This is the care that is guaranteed by extramural right now. It's in the law. It's defined in law in terms of the kind of care that will be provided. This bill repeals that, takes it out. It's gone, taken away. No direction to Medavie whatsoever of the kind of care that it's supposed to provide. So I brought a very straightforward amendment forward, Mr. Speaker, to say, look, don't repeal the definition. That's just crazy talk. Don't repeal the definition. Add all the other stuff you want to add in around services and so on and so forth. But don't repeal the definition, because it takes away the necessary legal direction in this new model that Medavie absolutely needs to guarantee the New Brunswickers are going to get the same kind of care that's provided now. But the amendment was defeated, Mr. Speaker, because in our dysfunctional system, the members of our committee from the government side automatically, routinely, blindly, unthinkingly defeat every opposition amendment that's brought forward to committee. So, Mr. Speaker, it's not working. We have bills that we barely touch the surface of. Public health, we spent 3 hours on, Mr. Speaker. I certainly didn't get any time yet on public health. The same with first contract. I have many amendments to improve those things. The public health bill, Mr. Speaker, does some good things, but it also does some worrisome things, Mr. Speaker, by enabling government to replace public health inspectors, certified public health inspectors, with generic inspectors without the kind of training and certification public health inspectors do, who are supposed to be out there protecting our health. This is a problem. To replace public health inspectors with generic inspectors who don't have that kind of certification and expect them to safeguard the public health in this province, a big problem. So I was going to propose an amendment on that, Mr. Speaker, but with time allocation, with this closure, that's never going to happen. Mr. Speaker, not on that. The same goes with first contract, Mr. Speaker. We spent 3 hours as a committee on it. We hadn't got past the official opposition members at that point in the 3 hours. But, Mr. Speaker, there are fundamental improvements can be made to that bill that would work better for both employers and employees in the first contract legislation, Mr. Speaker, to avoid strikes and lockouts, which is kind of the point. But that will never be heard, Mr. Speaker, because of this time allocation motion. So you can go on. You can look at other bills, Mr. Speaker. Government reorganization, we spent 15 minutes, yet there seems to be some fundamental changes with respect to the powers of Service New Brunswick that we didn't get to the bottom of, Mr. Speaker, in the time that we had to look at it. So you could go on and give other examples, but that's just to give you and the people watching a taste of what's not happened as a result of time allocation. Now, yes, 26 hours was spent on extramural, and so a time allocation motion that dealt with that single bill, okay, I could live with that. Mr. Speaker. But to put all of these bills into time allocation is totally uncalled for. This is supposed to be the committee at the committee stage. As I said, we're supposed to be looking at providing thorough and special examination of bills, Mr. Speaker. But this is how broken things are. We are a committee, a standing committee, Mr. Speaker, but the members of the standing committee who happen to be from the government side never speak. They never ask questions about the bills. They never make comments. They never propose amendments. They are silent until it's time to vote. This is a standing committee with one hand clapping, Mr. Speaker. So that just goes to how broken and dysfunctional this system has become. And, we could fix it. We can fix it. This is a committee and a legislature chamber full of good, decent people who got elected to make a difference. And yet, most of the members feel like they're trapped in a system, Mr. Speaker, that is immovable, that we can't fix, that we can't return to functionality because it's the way it's been for a long time, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, it hasn't always been this way, and it certainly isn't this way in other parliaments in Canada or throughout the Commonwealth or in the Mother Parliament of Westminster, Mr. Speaker. We think back to some of the great premiers of this province when the legislature was far more functional over the years. From our first Acadian premier, Peter Viano, Mr. Speaker, the father of our modern road highway system, or Hugh John Fleming, who built our electricity system and ensured we got a fair shake when it came to transfer payments from Ottawa and the Support for Economic Development, and Louis J. Robichaud and his revolutionary program for equal opportunity, and Richard Hatfield, who built on what Louis J. Robichaud did. The legislatures of those administrations, those governments functioned far more effectively, Mr. Speaker, and wouldn't ever have been considered dysfunctional as is the case today, Mr. Speaker. So, by and large, we have this situation where at committee, recognizing that government is not the government members on the committee will automatically, blindly, unthinkingly vote down amendments, proposed amendments. What does that leave for the other members of the committee to bring forward, Mr. Speaker? If we can't amend a bill, which is kind of the purpose of this, and in our examination, that means that way more time than otherwise might happen is used up with, repetition, tedious questions, because with the knowledge, given the knowledge that the government members on the committee are going to automatically vote against any proposed amendments. So in effect, we can't do our work. And so knowing that the opposition members are going to be asking repetitive and tedious questions, and sort of just filibustering going on, and this bill or that bill, then the government side, Mr. Speaker, feeds the opposition members bills they know they're going to waste time on. So we get bills that the opposition members want to waste time on, and the bills that we need to be considering don't come forward in our agenda. So it's this crazy game of chicken, Mr. Speaker, and so that lots of time is spent on a single bill like Bill 5, and then the government comes and says, well, you had 26 hours is plenty of time, and they fed that. They fed that, and so it just speaks to the dysfunction of this system, Mr. Speaker. I haven't, in my career, ever seen so much time wasted of well-paid public servants, well-paid elected officials, on accomplishing nothing, Mr. Speaker. So instead of our jobs as lawmakers, we are at most a reluctant audience for the tedious and repetitive back and forth between the opposition members of the committee and the government members or the minister on the bills, Mr. Speaker. And that accomplishes nothing. Because, Mr. Speaker, the executive branch in this government, and I think previous governments as well, have stopped seeing the members of this legislative assembly as lawmakers. They've stopped seeing the role of the members of this legislative assembly as lawmakers, Mr. Speaker, but rather to regard us as simply a rubber stamp, Mr. Speaker. And by God, I am no rubber stamp, Mr. Speaker. And I don't appreciate being treated that way, which is why I continue to prepare amendments, because that's part of my job, Mr. Speaker, as a lawmaker, to help ensure, through fulsome debate on the government bills that are brought forward at committee, that those bills, proposed laws, that come out the other end, that they're as good and serve the purpose of those laws as possible through our collective work on those bills, Mr. Speaker. But there's no sense of collective work on those bills, Mr. Speaker. We just have competition and this insane notion of this work being a team sport, Mr. Speaker, rather than doing the work we need to do on behalf of the legislative, or the behalf of the people of this province and the people who sent us here, Mr. Speaker. So we can change. We can change. And maybe this all began to really start to slide with the McKenna sweep when there was no opposition, Mr. Speaker. But we can change. Maybe it will take a minority government to change. Maybe it will take proportional representation to change. But we need something that is going to force collaboration between parties in this legislative assembly to work more effectively on behalf of the people of this province, to create laws that are as effective as possible to serve the needs of New Brunswickers, to serve the common good, to meet the public interest. That's our role as lawmakers, Mr. Speaker. So I think once we start thinking of ourselves as lawmakers collectively, that gives us a collective responsibility to work at it together in collaboration, Mr. Speaker, at committee stage. And the Legislative Assembly as a whole could give our committee a more robust mandate. We could have research capacity, Mr. Speaker, so that we weren't just relying on the partisan research capacity of the parties at committee, but research capacity provided from the library, which could become the Library and Research Office for the Legislative Assembly. That could make an improvement, Mr. Speaker. But I'll say this. I know we can improve. I know we can do better. I know we can restore the kind of functionality and effectiveness that parliamentary democracy is supposed to provide the people of this province in this Legislative Assembly. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Je reconnais les députés.